Today, I want to talk about podcast hosting. And by that, I mean the way that you distribute your podcast to Apple, Spotify, and all of the other platforms where people are going to listen to your show. It's a bit confusing because when most people think podcast hosts, they think of the person hosting the podcast. But there are a few things you want to consider before you choose a place to host your podcast. One is going to be whether or not you anticipate that you are going to want to monetize your show. There are a lot of platforms that just let you host your podcast, get your RSS feed, and you can submit that to Apple, Spotify, and all of the other places. But there are certain podcast hosts that will offer dynamic ad insertion, for instance, which is great if you want to do cross promotion or if you have paid sponsors. And some even have ad marketplaces where you just put in your ad markers and it'll pull ads from the marketplace based on your show and the demographics that the sponsors have picked out. So for instance, you could hear a Starbucks ad on your podcast. It will be read by someone else and just placed into your podcast. That is one of the options that is out there if you are looking to monetize your podcast. So you will want to factor in your budget as well. There are free options like Spotify for Creators, which is a big go-to, but I've been trying to get as many people off of it as possible, just because I find you have more flexibility with other podcast hosts, especially ones that you're paying for. And I want to say typically on average, that'll be running you $15 to $20 per month, depending on who you choose and what they offer. There are some that are significantly more expensive, like Megaphone, which is also owned by Spotify, but a lot of their clientele are podcast networks that are looking to monetize at a bigger scale. But personally, what I'm using for this show right now is Acast. This is not sponsored by them. And I actually am on their free tier right after I had started this podcast. They switched up their tiers, so you can join Acast for free, but you are limited to 5 episodes. So the way I think of it is, if you choose to use Acast, for instance, you basically get a 5-episode trial run to see if you like the service. And then once your 5 episodes are up, you will have to pay for an account. And sometimes if you aren't sure what you need for your podcast, it is good to do that month-to-month option. This way it's easier for you to switch should you realize, oh, this particular podcast host doesn't have exactly what I'm looking for. But I've also hosted podcasts with Transistor FM, which I have really loved. Another thing to look out for, though, is whether or not they cap the number of downloads based on what tier you're on. There are some podcast hosts that will do that. So for example, if you're on the lowest paid tier, you might only get up to 10,000 downloads a month. So if your show takes off, then you end up having to spend more to accommodate, for instance, having 50,000 downloads a month instead of that 10,000. So those are things to just keep an eye out for when you are looking for podcast hosts. And everyone is going to have different goals for their show. So it is really important to just think about those things before you look for a podcast host. And honestly, you should be thinking about those things before you even start your podcast to begin with. So you're not trying to do it last minute after you already have your podcast trailer ready to go. So definitely do some research, figure out what is best for you. And again, I highly, highly recommend just going with a paid option, even if you start off at a lower tier and end up moving up to a higher tier if needed. And if you have any questions at all about suggestions for what would be best for you to use, please feel free to reach out. The email, my website is in the show notes, and you can contact me through there. Thank you all so much for watching, and if you want to know more about creating a podcast trailer, check out my interview with Ariel Nissenblatt.